You feel more spiritual than ever. You hear God in the silence. You crave solitude. You long for moments of deep worship that no one else seems to understand. You spend more time in prayer than in conversation, more time journaling than answering messages. You've never felt closer to God. And yet, you've never felt more alone. There's a part of you that wants to believe this is just a season, a sacred separation, that the growing distance between you and others is a sign of divine calling, that your isolation is holiness. But if you let yourself get quiet, really quiet, there's another voice whispering beneath the surface, and it doesn't sound like peace. It sounds like grief, because what you're calling spiritual intimacy might actually be something else entirely: emotional self-protection. We don't like to talk about this. It feels dangerous to question our own spiritual depth. But sometimes, the very faith we use to draw closer to God becomes the wall that keeps everyone else out. And it didn't start that way. It started with hunger, a genuine desire to know God, to find healing, to grow beyond surface-level religion. Maybe you pulled away from people who didn't understand your path. Maybe you needed space from communities that wounded you, judged you, or shamed your sensitivity. Maybe you found safety in solitude, and at first, that solitude felt sacred. But over time, it hardened. It became easier to pray alone than to open your heart again. It became safer to seek God in isolation than to risk being disappointed by people. Again, you told yourself you were being set apart, and maybe you were. But maybe, just maybe, you were also hiding from the vulnerability that relationships require, hiding from the discomfort of not being fully understood, hiding from the emotional weight of being close to others when your own heart still feels fragile. And here's where it gets blurry, because everything you're doing looks like spiritual maturity. You're reading the Word, you're listening to sermons, you're fasting, praying, seeking. No one would question your devotion, but deep down, you know what's missing. Not more revelation, not more anointing, connection, the kind that lets you feel human again, the kind that reminds you that you're not just a vessel or a prophet or a servant, you're also a person, with need, with fears, with a heart that wasn't meant to beat alone in a cave forever. This is the silent struggle of many deeply spiritual people, the hidden loneliness, the ache they carry in private, the friendships that faded slowly, the phone that doesn't ring anymore, the conversations that feel hollow but no one seems to get it, the growing distance between their spirit and the world around them. And sometimes it's easier to believe that's God's doing, that He's pruning your relationships, that He's protecting your peace, that He's isolating you to go deeper. But what if He's not? What if He's trying to bring you back into connection, back into community, back into the part of your heart that you closed off in the name of spiritual protection? It's important to understand that emotional withdrawal is often a trauma response, even when it wears spiritual clothing. After enough hurt, enough rejection, enough disillusionment, the soul starts to seek safety. And for many of us, that safety is found in God. But we forget, God didn't create us to only connect with Him. He created us to reflect Him, and He is relational. God Himself exists in community: Father, Son, Spirit, eternal, divine connection. And yet we think we're safer alone. We confuse isolation with intimacy, but they're not the same. Intimacy requires risk. Intimacy requires honesty. Intimacy requires presence, not just before God, but before people. And when we withdraw too far, too long, too often, something inside begins to dry out. The soul becomes over-spiritualized and undernourished. We lose the mirror of relation. We stop being sharpened. We stop being seen. And eventually, we start calling our avoidance discernment and our numbness peace. But it's not peace if it costs you your humanity. It's not discernment if it disconnects you from love. It's not holiness if it's just another word for fear. So what does this mean? Does it mean you're doing it all wrong? No. It means your soul is asking for something more, something deeper, something fuller. Because the goal was never to become so spiritual that you stopped being human. The goal was to become so healed that your spirit and your humanity could walk together again. And that healing begins by naming the truth. You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to keep pretending that you're stronger without people. You don't have to keep saying you're guarding your spirit, when really, you're guarding your heart from breaking again. You don't have to keep dressing your isolation in sacred language. You can name it for what it is, self-protection born from pain. And in naming it, you begin to loosen its grip. You begin to feel again. You begin to want again. You begin to wonder if maybe, just maybe, God isn't asking you to go deeper into yourself, but to go deeper into connection. Because yes, He met you in the silence. Yes, He spoke to you in the stillness. Yes, He held you in the seasons when no one else could. But He's not the God of endless distance. He's the God who became flesh, who touched lepers, who broke bread, who cried in front of His friends, who let others carry His cross when He was too weak to do it alone. And if He needed others, why do you believe you don't? In the next part, we'll explore what this reconnection looks like, not as a betrayal of your spirituality, but as a deeper expression of it. We'll talk about how healing doesn't mean losing your closeness with God. It means expanding it through others, through vulnerability, through love that feels risky but brings life. Because maybe your next step of faith isn't isolation. Maybe it's intimacy. You didn't wake up one day and decide to disconnect from everyone. It wasn't some conscious choice to isolate or withdraw. It was subtle, slow. It happened moment by moment, conversation by conversation, disappointment by disappointment, until one day you looked around and realized the more spiritual you became, the more alone you felt. You told yourself it was just a season. You called it consecration. You said you were focusing on your relationship with God, and in many ways, you were. But underneath the devotion, something else was forming, something quieter, something protective, a space that was no longer about intimacy with God, but about safety from people. Because the truth is, your heart had been through too much, too many relationships where you weren't seen, too many friendships where you were the one always pouring, always carrying, always giving, and never really held. Too many moments when you opened up, only to be misunderstood, or worse, spiritualized. Just pray more. God's using this. Everything happens for a reason, and slowly, your soul got tired of being explained away. So you stopped trying, not because you didn't care, but because you were done bleeding in front of people who only handed you bandages labeled faith. You didn't stop loving, you just stopped risking. Because being close started to feel too expensive. So when solitude came, it felt like relief. And that relief, you mistook it for God's approval. Because it's easy to call distance discernment when connection has only brought you pain. It's easy to say, God is separating me, when deep down, you've already separated yourself, just to breathe again. And let's be clear, sometimes God does call us into seasons of solitude, but those seasons are never built on fear. They're never rooted in wounds. They don't create permanent disconnection. They create depth so that when we return to people, we return healed, not hidden. But many of us didn't withdraw for revelation. We withdrew for protection. Because something in us believed, if I'm fully known, I'll be fully abandoned. And that belief, that deep, old belief, still lives in the shadows. It doesn't show up during worship. It doesn't speak loudly during prayer. But it drives the moment you pull away after someone gets too close. It shapes the hesitation you feel when a new relationship starts forming. It whispers when someone asks, "How are you really?" And you smile and say, "I'm good," because vulnerability is too dangerous. That's the place we're entering now. The unspoken contract your heart made with pain. I'll stay spiritual, as long as I don't have to stay open. But here's the beautiful, terrifying, healing truth. God didn't create you to live locked inside yourself. He created you for communion, not just with Him, but with others. And not just on the surface, not just in safe, scripted conversations about sermons or theology, but in the messy, human, holy places of real connection. In tears, in laughter, in hard conversation, in holding someone's hand while they break, and letting them hold yours too. Because connection doesn't weaken your spirituality. It tests it. It shows whether the love you claim to receive from God is safe enough to give away. And here's what most of us don't realize, that love gets stuck when it can't move through you. You start to feel dry. Not because God left, but because your heart has nowhere to flow. It's like a river dammed up by fear. You keep reading the Word, hoping for freshness. You keep praying, hoping for breakthrough. But the breakthrough won't come until the walls fall. Not between you and heaven, between you and humanity. Because your soul wasn't designed to hoard God's presence. It was designed to share it. And you can't share what you won't allow others to touch. Let's go even deeper. Have you ever noticed how your spiritual passion sometimes feels strongest when you're alone, but it fades the moment you step into a room with people? That's not because you're holier in solitude. It's because your nervous system feels safer without the threat of emotional exposure. You feel free to weep with God, but not in front of a friend. You feel safe to talk to God about your wounds, but not to speak them aloud to someone who could disappoint you again. And so, you convince yourself that this must be how it's supposed to be, just you and Him, no one else. But here's the problem. Your faith was never meant to be only vertical. The cross doesn't just point up, it also points out. Love God, love people, not as separate commandments, but as interconnected reality. Because your love for God is proven in the way you risk love with others. Not flawless love, not perfectly safe love, but brave love. Love that says, I will not let past pain define my present relationships. Love that says, I will not let fear have the final word. Love that whispers, even if it hurts again, I'd rather feel pain with people than feel nothing alone. This isn't a call to reckless vulnerability. It's not a push to return to unsafe spaces. It's an invitation to evaluate why you left. And if the answer isn't healing, it's time to ask what would need to happen for you to try again. Because maybe you don't need a bigger calling. Maybe you don't need another spiritual assignment. Maybe you need to let someone see you, to hold space for your tears, to share your story without trimming it down to make it sound more spiritual, to be human, wildly, fully, unashamedly human, and to know that God meets you there too. In the next part, we'll talk about what that reconnection looks like, what it means to rebuild relationships after spiritual isolation, how to know the difference between holy solitude and fear-based avoidance, and how to begin trusting again, not because people are perfect, but because your heart was never meant to be a fortress. It was meant to be a bridge. You start to realize it in small moments, not in the dramatic ones, not in the breakdowns or the breakthroughs, but in the ordinary. You're standing in a room full of people, and yet you feel distant, not in body, but in soul. You're sitting at dinner, smiling, nodding, laughing even, but there's this ache in your chest that whispers, no one here really knows me. And what's harder to admit is, you're not sure you want them to. You've spent so long building a spiritual life that feels solid, structured, sacred. You've cultivated a rhythm of devotion that works. Prayer in the morning, worship at night, scripture in between. It brings you peace. It grounds you. But still, somewhere in the quiet, you wonder, why do I feel more at home with God than I do with people? The answer isn't obvious at first, because everything you're doing looks right. It looks holy. But here's the truth that slowly, gently rises. What you've called consecration may actually be a coping mechanism, a sacred disguise for emotional detachment. You didn't mean to isolate. You just got tired of being misunderstood. You didn't mean to shut down. You just got tired of explaining your heart to people who didn't know how to hold it. You didn't mean to make your faith a fortress. You just needed one place, any place, where you felt safe enough to be real, even if that meant being real only with God. But something happens when your spirituality grows stronger, while your relationships grow weaker. Something starts to bend, something starts to break, and not in a way that's obvious. It's more like a slow leak, a slow erosion of connection. A quiet collapse that's hard to name because it's hidden beneath the language of spiritual maturity. Because here's what no one told you. Disconnection can feel deceptively peaceful. The absence of people can feel like clarity until you realize it's just the absence of conflict. The quiet can feel like holiness until you realize it's just the absence of intimacy. And the longer you live there, in that isolated holiness, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between protection and numbness. Let's talk about that numbness. It's not always dramatic. It doesn't always look like depression or anxiety or collapse. Sometimes it just looks like flatness. You hear someone share their heart, and you feel nothing. You try to engage in a conversation, and your mind drifts. You avoid small talk, not because you're above it, but because you don't know how to connect without going too deep too fast. And most people can't follow you there, so you retreat. You keep your inner world locked away, not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. You've become fluent in the language of solitude. You've made silence your sanctuary, and in some ways, that's beautiful. But if you're not careful, solitude becomes exile. Not exile from God, exile from the part of you that was made for relationship. Because as spiritual as you are, you're also human. And to be human is to need connection. Not just connection with the divine, connection with the messy, beautiful, unpredictable world of other people. It's easy to think that deeper spirituality means deeper separation, that if you're truly walking with God, you'll naturally drift from others. But Jesus never modeled that. He withdrew to pray, yes, but he also sat at tables. He touched the unclean. He cried with friends. He showed up at weddings. He walked with crowds. He let people interrupt him. He didn't protect his energy. He gave it away freely, fully, without fear that his holiness would be compromised. Because holiness doesn't hide. It enters. It doesn't avoid brokenness. It walks straight into it. So why do we, in the name of spirituality, do the opposite? Why do we pull away from community when we feel overwhelmed? Why do we use guarding our peace as a reason to avoid hard conversation? Why do we feel more comfortable praying for someone than sitting in silence with their pain? Because real connection costs something. It costs your pride. It costs your control. It costs your carefully curated image. It forces you to admit that while your relationship with God may be flourishing, your relationships with others may still be fractured. You can't pray that away. You have to enter it. Here's the hard but healing truth. You weren't made to be safe all the time. You were made to be seen. And being seen will always feel like a risk, but it's a risk your soul was designed to. Because the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, these aren't concepts to be mastered in private. They're relational realities. They're only cultivated when you rub up against the imperfection of others, when you listen, when you forgive, when you wait, when you stay. And isn't that what you're longing for? Not just to be spiritually deep, but to be emotionally alive, to have someone look at you and say, I see you, I'm not going anywhere. To be able to say, this is who I am, not the version I perform, but the version I carry when no one's looking. That's the kind of connection your soul craves. That's the kind of love that brings your spirituality out of the clouds and back into the soil of real life. And here's the most important part. This doesn't mean abandoning your depth. It means sharing it. It means letting others into the sacred space you've fought to build with God. Not recklessly, not carelessly, but courageously. Because connection doesn't dilute your spirituality. It proves it. It shows that your faith isn't just a refuge, it's a resource. A resource that others can draw from, a well of compassion that others can drink from, a reminder that God doesn't live only in the heights of worship. He lives in the shared breath between friends, in the tears you wipe from someone's face, in the moment you say, I don't have the answers, but I'm here with you. In the next part, we'll begin the healing. We'll talk about how to move from protective isolation to intentional connection, without losing the sacred intimacy you've built with God, because you don't have to choose between being spiritual and being close to people. You were created to be both. And when you bring your full self into relationship, something holy happens. Your faith stops being a place to hide and starts becoming a bridge that leads others home. You've spent so long protecting your faith, building a sanctuary around your soul, guarding your heart from the noise, the drama, the shallow conversations, the disappointments, and in many ways, it worked. You've become deep, sensitive, awake. But here's a question that doesn't come with a Bible verse or a sermon outline. Are you still open? Not just to God, to people. Because somewhere along the journey, The shield you used to guard your spirit started turning into a wall. And now, even the good people, the kind ones, the safe ones, they can't seem to get through. You've convinced yourself it's better this way, that it's cleaner, simpler. You don't have to worry about being misunderstood, about explaining your inner world, about softening who you are so someone else can handle it. Alone is safer. Alone is clearer. Alone is manageable. But alone is not love. Love doesn't stay locked inside. It doesn't live in echo chambers of one-way conversations with heaven. Love moves, love risks, love reaches. And yes, love hurts. But it also heals. And that healing, it only happens when you come out of hiding. You weren't made to worship in a vacuum. You weren't made to only feel God in your room with the lights off and the worship playlist on repeat. That's a beautiful place, a sacred place, but it's not the only place. God didn't call you to build a castle of solitude. He called you to build a bridge, because connection is not a threat to your spirituality. It's the proof of it. Think about Jesus, the most spiritually whole person to ever walk the earth. He wasn't guarded. He wasn't suspicious of everyone. He didn't avoid crowds or dodge questions or isolate himself in the name of protecting his anointing. He entered their pain. He ate with the rejected. He wept with the broken. He walked with people, messy people, wounded people, people who would betray him, and still, he stayed open. What would it look like if you did the same? Not recklessly, not without boundaries, but intentionally. What if you stopped assuming that everyone will leave, that no one will understand you, that your depth is too much for anyone to handle? What if you stopped using your spiritual sensitivity as a reason to disconnect and started seeing it as a gift for connection? Because people need your depth, they need your compassion, they need your perspective, but most of all, you need to give it. Because gifts were never meant to be stored, they were meant to be shared. And the more you keep your soul hidden behind layers of just me and God, the more you cut yourself off from the sacred mirror that only relationship provides. Because here's what's true. You can only grow so far alone. Eventually, you hit a ceiling. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because some things can only be healed in the presence of others. You can't learn trust in a vacuum. You can't practice forgiveness by yourself. You can't discover grace until someone sees your worst and chooses to stay. You can't experience true intimacy until you let someone close enough to disappoint you. That's where real spiritual formation happens. Not in the perfection of solitude, but in the tension of togetherness. And I get it. You've been hurt, misunderstood, maybe even betrayed by people who claim to be spiritual, people who used scripture as a weapon, people who labeled your emotions as weakness and your honesty as rebellion. But their failure doesn't get to define your future. Not everyone is them. Not everyone will hurt you the way they did. Not everyone will shrink from your sensitivity or fear your depth. Some people are waiting for someone like you, someone who sees beyond the surface, someone who hears what isn't said, someone who walks into a room and feels what others are too busy to notice. You are not too much. You've just been giving yourself to people who were never equipped to hold you. But there are people who can, and you don't find them by hiding. You find them by being seen, by showing up, not just as the person who prays the loudest, or serves the hardest, or speaks the wisest, but as the human who sometimes doubts, sometimes feels lost, sometimes just needs someone to say, "I'm glad you're here." And if you've never heard those words before, let me say them now. I'm glad you're here. Not because of what you can do, but because of who you are. A soul that feels deeply, a heart that longs honestly, a spirit that sees what others miss. That's not a burden. That's a blessing. But a blessing left in the dark loses its power. So bring it into the light. Let people see you. Let people know you. Let people love you. Not the idea of you. Because the God you worship in secret is the same God who created you for community. And He doesn't want to share you with others because He wants less of you. He wants to share you because you carry more than you realize. And your healing? It won't come just in prayer. It will come in people, in laughter that surprises you, in conversations that don't require explanation, in the slow unfolding of a safe space where you no longer have to be the spiritual one. You just get to be you. In the next part, we'll talk about how to move toward that space, how to begin opening again without losing yourself, how to rebuild trust without re-entering trauma, how to stay spiritual and stay present in the world, because your purpose was never meant to be carried alone. It was meant to be shared, and your next season might not be about going deeper into solitude, but about going deeper into connection. So here you are, after all the inner work, after the silence, the solitude, the sacred questions, after confronting the walls you built, naming the fear that wore the face of faith, and admitting the loneliness that echoed louder than your prayers. You've come to the edge of something new, not just a deeper relationship with God, but a new kind of relationship with others. And this time, you're not running away from connection. You're reaching for it differently, not to fill a void, not to fix yourself, but because something inside you finally believes you can belong without losing yourself. You've learned that real spirituality doesn't demand that you disappear. It doesn't ask you to shrink or hide or pretend you're above the need for relationship. It invites you to expand, to let your soul stretch out and take up space in the lives of others, not as a savior, not as a project, not as a spiritual leader carrying everyone else's burden, but as a person with feelings, with limits, with needs. And that realization changes everything. You begin to relate differently. You're no longer looking for people to get you perfectly, because you no longer require perfection to feel safe. You're not chasing people who match your depth word for word, because you've learned to carry your own depth with quiet confidence. You're not craving connection to fix the ache. You're simply ready to be seen again, because hiding served its purpose. But you're not in survival mode anymore. Now, you're ready to live. That means taking new steps. Not huge, dramatic ones, but small, intentional ones. The kind that rebuild trust with the world around you. The kind that teach your nervous system that connection can feel safe again. Maybe it's letting a conversation go longer than usual. Maybe it's texting someone back when you normally wouldn't. Maybe it's showing up to a dinner and letting your silence be part of the table. Not something you apologize for, but something you offer as sacred present. Because here's the truth. You don't have to be on to belong. You don't have to be inspiring to be loved. You don't have to be insightful to be invited in. Sometimes, the most spiritual thing you can do is simply stay. Stay in the conversation. Stay in the awkward pause. Stay in the room when every part of you wants to retreat. Because healing doesn't always feel like fire or revelation. Sometimes it feels like letting someone finish their sentence without thinking about how to escape. Sometimes it feels like not needing to explain your silence. Sometimes it feels like laughing again and not wondering if that joy will be taken from you. And the more you practice that kind of presence, the more your relationships shift. You stop building them around performance. You start building them around permission. Permission to be honest, to be quiet, to be unsure, to be human. And when that happens, when you give yourself that permission, others feel it too. Your presence becomes an invitation for them to be real. And suddenly, you're no longer the only one carrying depth. You start seeing it rise in others, not because they changed, but because you gave them space to show up differently. That's the quiet power of a healed soul. It doesn't have to force intimacy. It creates conditions where intimacy becomes possible. But let's be honest, this path is still scary. You'll have moments where old fears rise again. Moments where someone's tone triggers your nervous system. Moments when vulnerability feels like a mistake. And in those moments, you'll be tempted to retreat, to spiritualize your withdrawal, to say, I just need to go be with God again. And sometimes you will. But this time, the return to solitude won't be a retreat from pain. It will be a reset for peace. You'll go back to God, not to hide, but to remember who you are, to return to your center, to reground before stepping out again. Because healthy connection doesn't replace your intimacy with God. It reflects it. The more you're anchored in Him, the more open you become to others. Not recklessly, but wisely. Not naively, but courageous. You start to realize that every true connection is a form of worship. That sitting with someone in their confusion is holy. That listening with your full attention is spiritual. That forgiving, not just in theory, but in present, is an act of sacred warfare. That hugging someone who once scared you with their vulnerability is part of your redemption arc. You begin to feel again, not just your own pain, but theirs. You begin to love again, not just in prayer, but in present. You begin to live again, not just in your journal or your devotional, but in the open spaces where real life happens. And you start to see God, not just in the quiet of your room, but in the face of the friend who finally knows the real you. And in those moments, you know something sacred has shifted. You're no longer living behind your spirituality. You're living through it. It's no longer your hiding place. It's your foundation. And from that foundation, you can build relationships that don't drain you. They reflect you. Not every connection will be deep. Not every friendship will be forever. But now, you know the difference between solitude and shutdown. Now, you know how to listen for peace, not as a reason to run, but as a guide for how to stay. Now, you know that loving God doesn't mean avoiding people. It means carrying His presence into their lives. And maybe that's the most powerful thing of all. Not that you healed alone, but that you let your healing be seen. So here's your next step. Not to go deeper into solitude, but to go deeper into sharing, to sit at the table again, to speak up again, to risk being known again. Because the spiritual life was never meant to be a fortress. It was always meant to be a bridge. And you, just as you are strong enough to walk across it. And this time, you won't be walking alone.